my name is Philippe Durand, a professor in the history department at McNeese State University.
And I'm Amanda Hasty. I'm a history major at McNeese. Welcome to Your Grandma Rocks, where we explore the lives of famous women in history.
Welcome and bienvenue à nos amis francophones. Vous écoutez la radio de l'Université McNeese.
On the program today, music and history as we retrace the life of a remarkable woman.
She is an author, an activist, and a mother.
She is also the cousin of the first democratically elected socialist leader of a South American country.
Best of all, she is still alive. For once in the show, we are not talking about a person who has been dead for centuries. Her name is
Isabel Allende. You may know her as the author of House of Spirits, among many other novels. She is also the cousin of the former president of Chile, Salvador Allende.
That's right. And this relationship between Isabel and Salvador Allende, that is key. What happened during the coup that killed Salvador Allende in the 1970s would influence the writings and the activism of Isabel Allende a lot.
Along the way, we'll sample some songs about Chile, many of them with a political message.
All right, Amanda, you are the one who did all the research for the show today, so you are in the driver's seat. What do you have in store for us as a song?
Our first song is My Chilean Flag by Martina and Maria Eugenia Diaz.
Mi banderita chilena, banderita tricolor. Mi banderita chilena, banderita tricolor. Colores que son emblemas, emblemas de mi nación. Mi banderita chilena, banderita tricolor. El azul de mi cielo, la nieve de las montañas, el rojo del copihue y de la sangre araucana. Mi banderita chilena, banderita tricolor. El alma de mi bandera, banderita tricolor. El alma de mi bandera, banderita tricolor. Es una pálida estrella que del cielo se cayó. El alma de mi bandera, banderita tricolor. Al azul de mi emblema te quedaste prendida, estrella solitaria, entre los pliegues dormida, flameando siempre serena mi banderita chilena, flameando siempre serena mi banderita chilena.
Bonjour and welcome back to Your Grammar Rocks. We just listened to Mi Banderita Chilena by Martina and Maria Eugenia Diaz from Chile. Je m'appelle Philippe Durand.
And I'm Amanda Hasty. Today we're exploring the life of Isabel Allende, writer and activist.
All right, I teach Latin American history, so I'm pretty familiar with the life of Salvador Allende, the president of Chile. But I don't know much about Isabel Allende, the writer, so you will have to walk us through her life, starting with, when was she born?
1942. Despite her love for Chile, Allende was born in Lima, Peru, not Chile.
Oh, what's the Chilean connection in her life then?
Her dad was Chile's ambassador to Peru. The family moved back to Chile after her dad abandoned the family. It was after this move to Chile that Allende became particularly close to her maternal grandfather, Agustin Cuevas. This relationship would prove important in her future literary works.
Born abroad, daddy was a diplomat, but then he left her in the family. Okay, got it.
Even after moving back to Chile as a child, Allende continued to spend much time abroad. Her mother was unable to legally remarry.
Because Chile was a very conservative Catholic society at the time?
I guess, yes, but her mother found a new quote-unquote husband. He was a diplomat named Ramon.
Another diplomat? Wow, she really had a type.
I guess so. As a result, Isabel spent much time in Bolivia and Lebanon. But in 1958, at 16, she was sent back to Chile due to instabilities in Beirut. She went back to her maternal grandparents. Her grandfather took her on frequent trips throughout the country, developing the deep love Allende has for Chile and its people. That grandpa had a profound impact on Isabel Allende. He told her, quote, "The one that pays the bills rules the house."
Well, I've tried to tell that to my kids, and it doesn't always work that way, even though I do pay the bills.
Well, it worked for her. By 1964, Isabel found herself in a loveless marriage and put that advice to work. She took on a job as a journalist in 1964.
That is a political act right there. I mean, in the early 60s, the expectation was that man would be the provider, not the woman.
She didn't. Isabel Allende worked as a journalist until Salvador Allende, her second cousin and godfather, was elected president of Chile.
Was she a successful journalist?
Well, when asked of her time as a journalist, Allende said she was lousy. She knew she was not objective and had no problem making up quotes to suit her story.
Well, you're researching Isabel Allende's life as part of the senior research seminar at McNeese. You're writing your senior thesis. And let me give you a little piece of advice. Do not make up quotes for your final paper, your thesis, because you're going to get an F for that. And you can quote me on that. Getting back to Isabel Allende, her loose ties to accuracy, that would seem to suit a fictional author even better than a journalist, right?
Or an activist. During the socialist era, Allende worked as a talk show host. While not as politically affiliated as the rest of her family, she was interested in feminism and women's rights.
I think we need to get into the career of Salvador Allende, her cousin, and how his presidency ended.
That's a topic for our next segment. But first, a song.
I see on the playlist that you selected this song, El Derecho de Vivir en Paz, by Victor Jara.
It means the right to live in peace.
El derecho de vivir, poeta Ho Chi Minh, que golpea de Vietnam a toda la humanidad. Ningún cañón borrará el surco de tu arrozal, el derecho de vivir en paz. Indochina es el lugar más allá del ancho mar, donde revientan la flor con genocidio y napalm. La luna es una explosión que funde todo el clamor, el derecho de vivir en paz.
Welcome back. I'm Amanda Hasty, co-host of Your Grandma Rocks, your favorite women's history show on KBYS.
Et je suis Philippe Girard. Vous écoutez la radio de l'Université McNeese.
Today we are talking about Isabel Allende. She is a feminist and author born in Chile. She is also the second cousin and goddaughter of democratically elected socialist leader Salvador Allende. That's where you're going to need to step up and give us a bit of historical background.
Will do. I'm actually teaching a course on modern Latin American history next semester, so that will be a nice refresher for me. Well, Chile, it has generally been among the richer countries in Latin America, but that wealth has not been well distributed. In the 60s, when Allende came along, a handful of rich families, they owned most of the land of the country. And as for the copper mines, which are the main exports of Chile, they were dominated by foreign companies, including the U.S. So you had a lot of people that were living in appalling misery in shanty towns that locally they called callampas, or mushroom cities. And that's exactly what Salvador Allende, her cousin, wanted to change. He was a doctor by training, and he thought that the best way to help all his patients, especially the poor ones, was to start by something very basic: combat malnutrition among poor children.
He was elected on that program in 1970 as president of Chile, but he had enemies.
Oh, yeah. The election, that was a three-way race, so Allende only won a plurality of the vote, not a majority. Also, he was a Marxist.
This was the Cold War. The only Marxist in power in Latin America was Fidel Castro in Cuba.
Though, to be fair, Allende was a democratic Marxist, not like Castro. Allende, he wanted to get to power through elections, to govern through elections, not through a dictatorship of the proletariat.
Which wasn't enough to calm his critics. For example, corporations were afraid that he would nationalize their business.
And the U.S. was also very concerned about this important country going communist in the middle of the Cold War.
On September 11, 1973, everything in Chile changed. A military coup was led by General Augusto Pinochet. By the end of the day, Salvador Allende was dead, and the country was plunged into a 17-year military regime. There is much debate surrounding the U.S. involvement in the coup that killed Salvador Allende. The original stance by the U.S. government and President Nixon was the U.S. government was only there to gather data and not engage, which is not believed to be the whole truth.
Hell no. Nixon and the CIA were well engaged in an active campaign to destabilize the Allende regime. And granted, Allende had plenty of enemies at home, starting with General Pinochet. But the coup also had the blessing of the Nixon administration.
A story for another time, perhaps.
Perhaps. So if you're interested, I would recommend watching the movie Missing with Jack Lemmon, which is about that coup in 1971 that overthrew Allende. Or the French movie Blame It on Fidel, La Faute à Fidel, which is about a little girl who lived through those years of the coup in Chile. Or an Italian movie called The Postman, Il Postino. And that one is about the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda, who fled in exile after the coup.
That poet, Neruda, was a big literary influence for Isabel Allende. After the coup, she spent several months in Chile, helping those in need. She and her family hoped that democracy would prevail and the military regime would be short-lived, which proved to be anything but the truth. It lasted 17 years. During this time, Allende spent a great deal of time in Venezuela and then the United States. It was also during this time that Allende began her career as an author.
What convinced her to start writing fiction?
She was heavily influenced by her ailing maternal grandfather. In fact, she only started writing it as a letter to him and a way to keep him alive, at least in spirit. That book, House of Spirits, was autobiographical in nature without being an outright autobiography.
Write about what you know. That is the advice that is often given to aspiring writers, even for fiction.
Allende can also be quoted stating that House of Spirits is not only autobiographical in nature, but it is also a diary, a contemporary history, and a political testimony. It, along with many of Allende's other works, possess strong trends of magical realism.
Maybe you should tell our listeners what magical realism is.
Magical realism is a literary genre with deep roots in Latin America. It typically shows real-world characters in real-world settings, but there is an undercurrent of magic to everything. There basically exists a tappable well of magic that could be tapped into by someone.
Think of it as a dream. Our dreams at night rehash what actually happens in our lives until they take a very weird turn. So getting back to Isabel Allende, how was her book, House of Spirits, received in Chile?
Well, the House of Spirits was banned in Chile, but that did not keep it from being passed around, with copies going for as much as 2 months' minimum wage salary.
You said she put a lot of herself in that book. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Allende developed her intellectual maturity during the socialist movements of her godfather and became an author at the death of her grandfather, and these influences show in her literature. In the book, it is rumored that the character Esteban Trueba is modeled after U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger,
who played a very big role in the ouster of her godfather, Salvador Allende.
And then later on, Esteban and Clara are the central figures of the family, much the same way she views her grandparents. The rape scenes in the book can also be seen as the raping of the land by the Pinochet regime. Her feminism shows through as well, when the illegitimate grandson of Trueba rapes the legitimate granddaughter of Trueba to punish him. This alludes to Allende's belief that women pay the price of the wars of men. Throughout the book, there is systematic lying about events, censorship of certain events for the, quote, public good, and the various ways people are made disappear. All of these are references to what was being suffered by the residents of Chile.
The Pinochet dictatorship, that was indeed brutal. After the coup, Pinochet set up a prison camp / torture center in the soccer stadium in the capital, Santiago de Chile, and thousands of people who went there were never heard from again. By the way, one of the victims was Victor Jara, the guitarist and the singer we heard during our last musical break. The men who arrested him on behalf of Pinochet, they broke all his fingers and then asked him mockingly to play a song for them. And in response, he began to sing Venceremos, which was a pro-Allende anthem.
We'll listen to it later on in this program.
Well, we're going through the Nueva Canción playlist. That was a folk movement for songs in the 1960s in Chile, and those songs were often engaged politically. But anyway, back to Isabel Allende.
House of Spirits is not the only novel written by Isabel Allende. In fact, it is one of 23, with the 24th being released in 2023. Not bad when you consider she didn't start writing until 1979 and is still releasing books at 80 years old.
We can take a break, even though she's not.
Sure, you have the playlist in front of you.
Okay, let's go then. Here's a song about the capital of Chile, apparently. It is called Santiago de Chile by Soledad Bravo.
Allí supe que amar era terrible, llorando por el humo sempiterno de aquella ciudad acorralada por símbolos de invierno. Allí aprendí a quitar con piel el frío y a echar luego mi cuerpo a la llovizna, en manos de la niebla dura y blanca, en calles del enigma. Eso no está muerto, no me lo mataron, ni con la distancia, ni con el vil soldado. Eso no está muerto, no me lo mataron, ni con la distancia, ni con el vil soldado. Allí entre los cerros tuve amigos que entre bombas de humo eran hermanos. Allí yo tuve más de 4 cosas que siempre he deseado. Allí nuestra canción se hizo pequeña entre la multitud desesperada. Un poderoso canto de la tierra era quien más cantaba. Eso no está muerto, no me lo mataron, ni con la distancia, ni con el vil soldado. Eso no está muerto, no me lo mataron, ni con la distancia, ni con el vil soldado. Una sombra, el rostro del que ya no se veía, y en el oído me susurró la muerte que ya parecería. Allí yo tuve un odio, una vergüenza, niños mendigos de la madrugada, y el deseo de cambiar cada cuerda por un saco de balas. Eso no está muerto, no me lo mataron, ni con la distancia, ni con el vil soldado. Eso no está muerto, no me lo mataron, ni con la distancia, ni con el vil soldado. Eso no está muerto, no me lo mataron, ni con la distancia, ni con el vil soldado. Eso no está muerto, no me lo mataron, ni con la distancia, ni con el vil soldado.
Bonjour à tous and welcome back to Your Grammar Rocks on KBYS. Je suis Philippe Girard.
And I'm Amanda Hasty. Today we are covering the life of Isabel Allende. Allende is a writer and a feminist and the goddaughter of former Chilean President Salvador Allende.
Before our break, you mentioned how her breakthrough novel, House of Spirits, was deeply inspired by her family and the politics of her home country.
Allende had been interviewed stating that there is no way to come from where she came from and not make art that reflects politics. Her very existence is fuel for her art form. Take her novel Dos Palabras, for example. The character Eva Luna comes from her background. Like Isabel Allende, she travels around Chile as a young adult with her grandfather. She is able to see the effects of poverty and wealth in ways she never experienced prior. We also meet Belisa. Belisa attempts to escape her poverty-stricken existence and flees to the coastland. It is there she learns about reading and writing, concepts completely foreign in her mind.
One could also see the parallels between Belisa and Allende. Both had to flee their homelands, though for different reasons, and both found words in the new lands.
But back to Eva Luna. As a child, Luna grew up in the kitchens, learning to tell stories by listening to the radio. This is very similar to the story Allende tells about how she learned storytelling. Allende said she used to hang around the kitchens, listening to the house cleaners and cooks tell stories and listening to the radio. This is another parallel about herself that Allende works into her characters.
I'm always fascinated by other people's writing process, especially people outside of the historical field. Writing in history, that's pretty straightforward. Sure, we try to write in a compelling way, and there are different ways that we can tell a story, but ultimately we are bound by the evidence. We can't make up facts. We need to tell history as it actually happened. The writing process for a novelist, that must be completely different. I mean, the sky is the limit. So apparently, even for a work of fiction, she cycled back to the true events of her country and the true events of her own life. There is no escaping reality, even when writing something called magical realism.
That's food for thought. Another song?
Sure, but in the meantime, I need to mention just yet another movie. Because that novel, House of Spirits, that was made into a major motion picture back in the 90s with Jeremy Irons, Meryl Streep, Glenn Close, Winona Ryder, and many others. So add this to your Netflix queue. But when it comes to the Spotify queue, the next song on our list is Venceremos by Inti Illimani.
Which means we all win.
This is not just any song, by the way. That was the one used by Salvador Allende for his 1970 presidential campaign, and that became a rallying anthem for the left in Chile. It's so popular that Salvador Allende had credited that song for his victory in the presidential election.
Desde el hondo crisol de la patria se levanta el clamor popular, ya se anuncia la nueva alborada, todo Chile comienza a cantar, recordando al soldado valiente, cuyo ejemplo lo hiciera inmortal. Enfrentemos primero a la muerte, traicionar a la patria jamás. Venceremos, venceremos, mil cadenas habrá que romper. Venceremos, venceremos, la miseria sabremos vencer. Venceremos, venceremos, mil cadenas habrá que romper. Venceremos, venceremos, la miseria sabremos vencer. Campesinos, soldados, mineros, la mujer de la patria también, estudiantes, empleados y obreros, cumpliremos con nuestro deber, sembraremos las tierras de gloria, socialista será el porvenir, todos juntos seremos la historia, a cumplir, a cumplir, a cumplir. Venceremos, venceremos, mil cadenas habrá que romper. Venceremos, venceremos, la miseria sabremos vencer. Venceremos, venceremos, mil cadenas habrá que romper. Venceremos, venceremos, la miseria sabremos vencer.
You're listening to Your Grandma Rocks on KBYS. I'm Amanda Hasty.
Et je suis Philippe Girard. Today we are retracing the life of Isabel Allende. She is a feminist and author of the novel House of Spirits and a whole host of other books, as well as the cousin and goddaughter of Salvador Allende, a president and martyr of the left in Chile.
Even today, at 80 years old, Isabel Allende is still writing and releasing novels, with one slated to come out next year. She has also racked up numerous prestigious literary awards from throughout the world.
Such as?
The Novel of the Year in Chile, 1983, Author of the Year in Germany, 1984, Best Novel of the Year in Mexico, 1985, and it goes on. The Times named The House of Spirits one of the 60 best books in the past 60 years. And that doesn't even scrape the surface of the awards she's received. According to our website, she has received over 60 awards in more than 15 countries. She has also received honorary doctorates from 15 different international universities, including the University of Chile, Columbia College, and Mills College, just to name a few. She also set up a foundation in honor of her daughter Paula in 1996.
So what is that foundation about?
Her daughter Paula contracted a typically non-fatal disease, but ended up succumbing to it anyway. Isabel Allende took the loss of her daughter especially hard, opening up the foundation to honor her. Paula had always had a heart for advocacy and activism, and Allende uses the Isabel Allende Foundation to fund projects to help women in impoverished areas, something her daughter would appreciate.
I guess we're back where we started. The personal is political. For Isabel Allende, politics is very personal since the president of Chile was a personal relative. Her political education, that began with her grandfather. Her novels fed on her personal stories, and now her political activism that is inspired by something very personal, her daughter.
What a life, and we're glad we could share it with you.
Quelle vie incroyable, en effet.
This program is funded by a Juliet Hartner grant for women in the humanities.
The program was also sponsored by the History Department of McNeese. Interested in getting a degree in history? Well, call the McNeese Admissions Office 475-5504.
Thank you and goodbye.
Merci et au revoir. We will leave you with a rap song, El Otro Chile by Potabos.
Whoa, nah. Whoa, nah. Yeah, yeah. En la noche luna llena, en el día suena la sirena. No, na, na, na. Yeah. No, na, na, na. Vengo de Chile, el Bajo Chile es anónimo. Actores secundarios en un filme antagónico. Ese Chile es al que definen de clase media, pero tiene las medias deudas que los afligen y lo asedian. El Chile de mis iguales y los tuyos, que no salen en las páginas sociales del Mercurio. No tienen estatua y no tienen calles principales, y no son grandes personajes en las putas historias oficiales. El de montones de poblaciones que nacieron por los mismos pobladores en las tomas de terreno. El de casas bajas variadas y los bloques, las casas chubi y los departamentos básicos pa' pobres. El de los almacenes y bazares varios, que quiebran cuando invade el barrio un supermercado. El de los cachureos periversias, que resisten con fuerza al monopolio bestia del centro comercial. El de los que se van en metro pa' La Vega, parados y repletos, y en metros a la casa llegan. De los que hacen su viaje en Transantiago micro y no pagan el pasaje cuando está a la mano, mijo. El Chile de los carritos de completo y sopa y pillas que siempre pillas en la esquina de un gueto, donde hay menos escuelas que botillería. El Chile de mis secuelas, de mis penas y mis alegrías.
El Chile común y corriente, ese que no salen comerciales de TV, donde los vivos se abren porque aquí son cianes. Cuidado con quemarse con este mensaje. Vengo de Chile común y corriente, ese que no salen comerciales de TV, donde los vivos se abren porque aquí son cianes. Cuidado con quemarte con este mensaje.
Vengo del Chile de Víctor Jara y la Violeta Barra, los hermanos Vergara, el Cizarro y el Zafrada. El Chile de los 33 mineros atrapados que casi murieron por culpa de negrero empresario. Ese Chile de los liceos industriales, particulares, subvencionados y municipales. El de universitarios endeudados que tienen que pagar como 2 carreras más de las que han estudiado. El Chile que realmente sufrió con el cataclismo y perdió su vivienda, su familia y sus niños queridos. Un terremoto no discrimina y es verdad, pero cierta forma de vida es asesina y criminal. El de los hospitales colapsados, donde no hay camillas y te atienden en las sillas o en cualquier lado. Y en invierno los pasillos están llenos de niños enfermos, y un infierno es si el auge no te ha abrigado. El de vendedores ambulantes, de estudiantes, deudores, trabajadores y cesantes frustrados. El de subcontratado, portuarios, mineros, pobladores y obreros explotados.
Vengo del Chile de la mayoría, que cargan en lomos el trono de unos pocos todo el puto día. El que está en las venas de mi poesía, el Chile de mis secuelas, de mis penas y mis alegrías.
Vengo de Chile común y corriente, ese que no salen comerciales de TV, donde los vivos se abren porque aquí son cianes. Cuidado con quemarse con este mensaje. Vengo de Chile común y corriente, ese que no salen comerciales de TV, donde los vivos se abren porque aquí son cianes. Cuidado con quemarte con este mensaje.
Sus discursos de unidad nacional son solo eso, discursos porque otra es la realidad. Vivimos en una sociedad segregada y no es casualidad, siempre lo quiso así la clase.